there's been, well, thank you for the questions. There's a lot of questions that are coming up here for our panel. Maybe we could start with the question here from Jeremy Morley. And Jim, this is one directed to you, which is really, you mentioned crowdsourcing data as part of the picture for infrastructure modelling. But above that, how, Jim, would you think we could fit citizen science into the way that DAFNI works?
Thanks, Jeremy, for that question. I mean, the reference to citizen science was a passing reference to a potentially very big and quite challenging issue. And I think the starting point needs to be really carefully thinking through the frameworks for where evidence, observations, opinions from people can actually contribute and enter into infrastructure modelling in the way we've all been describing this morning. And I think it enters in via at least two routes. One is as a way of obtaining empirical evidence about things which we really struggle to learn about. So, for example, about the condition of infrastructure, what has actually happened in extreme events. And secondly, it provides a route of legitimizing and understanding what people want and what they value in relation to infrastructure. And I think that's a really important challenge. It's certainly a challenge for the National Infrastructure Commission, which is a combination of a handful of commissioners and a expert secretariat. And we're often challenged in terms of, well, in what sense are you legitimate? And part of the answer to that is we get out and about. In fact, other commissioners are in Leeds right now, talking to people about the infrastructure in that place, and we've done quite a lot of survey work and focus group work to understand what people want in relation to infrastructure. But I think crowdsourcing potentially provides a route to answering those questions. How does DAFNI fit into that? As I say, the first step would be to provide the frameworks by which we can then elicit relevant pieces of citizen-based evidence and opinion in a way which itself is unbiased and deals with all of the issues associated with social science methodology that we know about.
Jim, thank you very much for that. Brian, are you mic'd up? Because I think
yes.
You are indeed. So I think there's a question here from John Blower for you, which is, I was wondering this as well. Does DAFNI have the remit and indeed the funding perhaps to store data in perpetuity, rather like the NERC data centres? If not, how would DOIs work?
In a sense, well, the short answer is this is why we haven't got DOIs in one level. In DAFNI, we haven't, in the current phase, sought to be a holder of reference data in that sense. It's kind of not where we've seen our place being. There are other holders of reference data that we can work with and we can access. With the Cedar archives, for example, with the Energy Data Centre, which stores a lot of research data from the energy community for the research community, and they have remits to provide reference data with the system for a long time, and we're not in the business of trying to take over their role. So we'd want to work with them and access their data and make it available to our research community. So so we haven't sought out that role explicitly. Now I can see that would see something that we would potentially arise over time. There's a lot of data that doesn't have such homes, and there's questions about where should we try and find homes for those things. And as more data is generated on the DAFNI platform, we would look to find ways to preserve it. But at the moment, or during the current phase, the development phase and the current phase project, we've not seen ourselves as the holders of that master data, if you like. Which is why we've not done DOIs. But if you're going to do more fair data in the long term, you're going to want to add those DOIs. So I think it's more of a future path than where we've seen ourselves at the moment. We've focused very much around that modelling platform. So we've seen our real strength.
Brian, thank you very much. Craig, I think there's a question here for you from an anonymous. You know who you are. So thanks. And I was really just wondering, Craig, do you have a sense whether one of the technologies in the future will be used more readily than another? Sort of geospatial data over machine learning. What do you think the balance will be for the sort of tools that DAFNI have available?
Is my mic working?
Sorry, are you mic'd up, by the way?
We'll see.
Yeah,
there we are. So I think there's space for both those data sets. You know, geospatial data is normally, it's generally known as the truth. It's a, machine learning data sets, otherwise a synthetically generated data set. So I think there's certainly scope for both. Machine learning can fill data gaps, and with data as geospatial as what is generally captured, what we know. So it can be assumed to be the truth in some cases. So I think I don't see either dominating, one dominating the other in the future. I think both are valid uses of data and data sources for modelling. And obviously as machine learning advances, there's space for that sort of synthetic data that fills holes where we have data gaps, be that spatial or non-spatial as well.
Right, thanks very much, Craig. Jonny, there's a question that's come to you from Gordon Masterton, which is, thanks very much for the presentation to you, to us. Whoops, where's it gone? It's just jumped off. But the value of modelling was very, very apparent from your talk, but really what is perhaps happening in Scotland? Do you know?
Just check on mic. Okay, I think you can hear me now. That's an interesting question, I guess, from the perspective of the modelling that we've only carried out so far, and the strategic solutions has been the focus. They're obviously located in England, so it doesn't necessarily include Wales or Scotland, but there's no reason why a national model couldn't be extended to those areas. I guess it's just not in the current scope of development. So yes, more than happy, I guess, for that to be discussed in further detail, potentially more with Jim and the group at Oxford, if there's more of an academic view on expanding the spatial coverage of the model.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jonny. Jim, I see there's another question for you here. It's another anonymous one. It's about Scope 3 emissions and how they're taken into account in the future of infrastructure development. And the suggestion is at present they're not really considered for most. How will Scope 3 emissions, do you think, be taken into account in the future?
Yeah, the problem of emissions accounting comes down to what scale and indeed what scope you're looking at. And I think that these questions in particular come up at project level and at business level, whereas the perspective in the Commission and indeed from the point of view of the national carbon accounting looks system-wide at the UK scale. So in that sense, many of these issues kind of become less material because we're looking at the entire set of emissions and the UK's national commitments to achieving net zero. So in a sense, that's the attraction of looking at a broad and national scale, is that the accounting issue becomes a bit more straightforward, though of course there are then the questions of cross-border carbon accounting and embedded emissions within materials.
Thank you, Jim. If I may, Richard, there was an interesting question here for you actually, which is from Jeremy Morley. could you talk a bit about how housing needs assessment is being dealt with in your work? Will that include all of these tangential needs and effects, such as the needs for EV charging, microgeneration and utility connections in the sort of modelling that you're discussing?
So I think that's probably getting down to the more the site level, below a scale at which we'd be operating. But equally, our methodology is designed to respond to user needs. So as I said, we're starting off with what the users want, and if that's something that comes out strong in the workshops, we would be looking at that. But I think at the moment, the demonstrator will work more at a sort of neighbourhood to local authority level, and it'd be overlaying potential housing site allocations with different climate change data, river flooding, coastal sea, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Richard. Brian, there's a question for you here. Just interested in knowing what sort of support DAFNI currently receive from industry, for example, commercial partnerships, big tech companies, and I guess by implication what the opportunities are to do that in the future.
So to date, it's not been our main focus. Most of the projects we've had have been research projects with the academic community. A number of them have had commercial partners or collaborators. We've been talking a lot with government agencies. We've seen the Environment Agency today, and we've had quite a lot of discussions and indeed some small projects with government agencies, and I think that's a particularly important area to work with. I can see that will very much like to expand. When it comes to tech, to industry, yeah, we've had a lot of conversations, and some projects. I mentioned the Credo project earlier, so that has been a very useful opportunity to explore the issues you get into rapidly when you're dealing with commercial companies and commercial data. The issues around particularly around the confidentiality and the extra constraints that bring in, and indeed the kind of difference that comes in sort of mode of working when you get the academic sector. I mean, academic software development is approached in a somewhat different way than commercial software development, and I think that I think we've learned a lot from that. We would be very interested in pursuing that. I think there's a huge opportunity there, particularly in digital twin area. And we've also been working with the Hartree Centre, which is our commercialisation arm, if you like. They have a stand here to sort of further develop those commercial links. So developing rather than so it's something we would certainly want to discuss more.
Thank you very much, Brian. And time, I think, for a couple of quick last questions. Firstly, Craig, and then Jonny. First of all, Craig. So where's it gone? Oh, yes, here we are. Just from your modelling experience, Craig, how do you see the use of open data standards such as industry foundation classes, ontologies such as City GML for modelling infrastructure projects? And do you think there's a role where the government should mandate some of these standards?
Good question. So I guess in many regards, a lot of, obviously, as the sort of question alludes to, in research, sometimes standards do get forgotten about in terms of open data standards, being able to share the data, and so in modelling practices, we can forget about the data standards sometimes. And yeah, it's an important point that when it comes to data sharing and making more data open and shareable, that actually maintaining and actually applying those data standards is quite critical. Obviously, there's a bit of a trend to that, especially with things like BIM, build information modelling, and things like that. There's more trends to actually making those sort of data sets sort of, actually adhere to those sort of standards. Should UK government mandate that? That's a very big question. Not what I'm going to put a yes or no to. It certainly should be encouraged, and I think everyone working in this area would like to see that. It would make sharing data a lot more easier, and undertaking projects such as OpenClim, where we've got different models and data sets from a whole host of different sources combined, would make that an awful lot easier. So yeah, I think it should be encouraged. I'm not going to say the government should mandate it.
Thank you, Craig. And one last quick question to Jonny, if I may, which is, Jonny, so you showed this modelling framework across with all the tools and the interlinking, and there's this question really about is there a need or perhaps an opportunity around assuring modelling software quality in tools like DAFNI or in DAFNI? What's your view on the on sort of assuring modelling software quality?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess it's something we've not necessarily looked at in terms of the actual quality of the software. It's something we're not really that aware of. We've done quite a lot of work on assurance around the consistency of the model itself. But in terms of the quality of the software, I guess the only way we'd approach that is to look at alternatives, to build a model in an alternative software and see what the trade-offs are between them, or potentially compare with other tools that are more commonly used in the industry, such as Aquator. But we've not necessarily done any of that work yet. I think that would be part of a future work programme.
Jonny, thanks very much. And may I just, oh yes, please sir.
Can I add a question to the last one? At least, do we have the tools to actually assure the quality of the data as well? Just the models, once the data will fit those.
So your question is, can the data be assured as well as the models? Just to make sure that colleagues online can hear that. Thank you. Jonny?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we've done some more work on that. And I think we've got more of a handle on the data quality. So we do go through assurance processes, so checking the validation of that data, mainly the hydrological data, checking how it compares to gauge information. So yeah, we do go through that process because the water resources model is ultimately built on a models and models process. So all the inputs to that model have been scrutinised. There are obviously room for improvement, and it's just a very big process. So again, we'll go through that in future phases, especially around the hydrological modelling and the groundwater inputs, to make sure that they're more representative. But inevitably, there's always going to be small differences, and then it's a difficult problem about understanding how those errors or small differences then might propagate through the models. So there's another bit of work to be done around that as well.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's an interesting point to make. It's data and the models, to be sure. Panel, thank you very much for your answers to the questions. Just a quick round of applause, please, for the panel. There's lots of questions here, so keep them coming. And what we'll do is we'll probably produce a digest of all these questions and make sure we pass them to the panel to answer. Just before we break for lunch, and colleagues watching this online as well, what we'll do is open another poll. We've heard actually this morning about the wide range and breadth of the areas that DAFNI can be applied to, and integrated modelling and systems of systems modelling across a whole range of themes. And I think the DAFNI team would be interested to hear from you about which areas that you heard about would be appropriate or of interest to you in terms of the future modelling activities in DAFNI. So, James, if we could open that poll, and what we'll do is we'll leave that running here, or we can go and have some lunch, and after lunch, after you've had your sandwich, please make use of the demonstrations and so on at the back as well, and do some networking and so on, and we're coming back, Marion, we'll be back. Just check when we're expecting to be back. 1:30. So if you could make your way back to the seats for 1:30. Thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed the morning.